putting my timer on. So if you hear a vibration, that's because I have to wrap it up. It's difficult to try and summarize a life experience in 12 minutes. But I will start by saying that I was born the first male of my grandfather. It may not mean anything to you, but in my family, that's a significant situation. In my early childhood, my mother was Catholic and my father was an evangelist, not ever practicing, but still there. And so I found myself going on Sundays, I would go to two different church services. I would go to the Catholic service, of which I received First Communion and all of the rituals. And I would also attend the evangelist church where my aunts and uncles were also participating in. It was, I think it was about 10 years old when I became baptized in the Protestant faith, in that evangelist faith. And I found that I was a true believer. And through that, I found a strong feeling of belonging, of being connected to a loving community, and that gave me that ability to do things for my God. I found that I could act for my God and felt good, and just was the community feeling was so powerful. Somewhere around when I started becoming a teenager, I started to question. I started to ask too many questions. The dogma that I was being taught had in my eyes, some flaws and needed to clarify. And every time I would ask, I would be put down and says, "You gotta believe." And I remember I was called the angel of confusion. So somewhere in that same time frame, the minister that I adored, that I looked up to, that had that direct connection with God, betrayed us. He took off I was living in Florida. He took off to Florida with one of the teenagers and just abandoned everything. And it was like the contradiction was so great, and I departed ways. And that also, about that same time, is when I discovered the power of fear and hate. And what I found is that now I know it. I didn't know it then, but I found that I was always afraid. I was afraid of everything. But the thing that I was most afraid of was that you would know that I was afraid, and that gave me the energy to do some really wacko stuff, People will look at me and say, "He's crazy," and I was. And so I'm a natural born leader. So I would have other teenagers that would follow my lead. And when you act out of fear and try to control, and you think that your safety is based on that, very bad things happen, and it created an environment that I am not proud of. Somewhere around when I turned 17, I think I became an adult. My mind changed, but I was stuck in the inner city in that environment, and that's when I discovered that I could escape. I joined the military. I joined the U.S. Army, and that allowed me to leave the inner city and go out. You would think that someone as wacko as I was, as would not be able to function in that kind of an environment. But I found that within the military, the structure, I found that I could swim. I felt safety. I felt comfort with that. I went on vacation and I found the love of my life, and we got married. I went back to Kansas, and within 3 or 4 months, I received orders to have a tour of Korea. That means that I would be a year separated. And I did. I complied with that, but I decided the military was no good. And I left, and that brought me to here, to Florida, with my wife. And at that point, I had a thirst for knowledge. So I entered the university and enrolled in the sheriff's department and just went about that. Well, as my children started to grow, I found that I had nowhere. I had misery. I had no guidance. I had no spirituality, and was depressed and just was going through a bad thing. And I remembered my childhood connections of feeling strong, and that's what led me to seek a religious environment that will give me what I needed. But everywhere I went, I was required to be someone who I was not, to put on a face and that was not acceptable until I was able to come in through that door over 20 years ago, and I found a loving community, people that would accept me the way I was, and that would encourage me to seek my truth and my spirituality. And that saved my life, changed who I was, and my family is so much stronger for that. I discovered that through being who I am, and my guide, I can't say that I believe in a higher power, an entity, a deities that is a higher power, but there's like a force, an energy field that is there. And that energy field, when I tap into love and to be of service to others, it energizes me. It gives me that joy of getting up in the morning and smiling and looking forward to what the adventures are going to bring me. And that is a gift that I was able to receive by walking into this octagon and be able to find the strength and the encouragement to seek that truth that is uniquely mine. And so I don't know, I honor my ancestors. If I can give you something of my religious thing, I honor my ancestors. I see where my great-great-grandfathers, their actions that led for me to be here in my journey. And whenever I make a decision, I think of where they came from and their values and how it affects me. And I also look at how my actions today are going to affect my grandchildren's grandchildren, multiple generations in the future. And so that is a truth that I have found here in this octagon that allowed me to find who I was. If you are looking to be strengthened spiritually, to feel that feeling of well-being that comes by tapping into love and to being of service to others and finding your truth, then you're in the right place. Because I am so honored, I am so proud, I am so grateful that my journey brought me through that door. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliseo. Wow, you've come a long way. Our next speaker is Anna Olga Vaquer, but we all know her as Soledad. She's been a Unitarian Universalist since 1990. For the past 20 years, she has been an active member here, working on the Hospitality, Social Justice, Welcome, Ways and Means, and Worship Associates Committee. This coming year, she will begin her tenure as a member on the Board of Trustees. You've worked your way up, haven't you? She considers UUC her spiritual home, and its members are her real family. Soledad.
Would you like to have a cup of tea with me? Those were the words of one of the women who I cleaned their home for when I first arrived in this country. She invited me for a cup of tea. And so it began my spiritual journey, sharing a cup of tea. Like most immigrants that come here and are not able to speak English, we find ourselves doing the best we can to earn a living. And my living was cleaning up homes. And so I went to this English lady who was married to a Spaniard. And she invited me, after I cleaned her home for the first time, to sit down and share a cup of tea. That's the first time I have ever been invited to sit down. And I have ever been given the opportunity to have a conversation. She spoke Spanish, of course. And then I learned that over a cup of tea, every week, I had the opportunity to have a real conversation that made my spirit grow. As I established myself here in the United States, I realized the poor and perhaps sad beginning I had with the spiritual or religious organization. Yes, I was raised Catholic initially, and then when I was 7, my mother decided to become a Jehovah's Witness. And her struggles with finding her own spiritual peace, I sort of navigated through that very dark period of my life. And then at the age of 15, when I left, I find myself migrating to San Francisco, California, particularly Palo Alto. And that was a very confusing time for me because I was a single mom, and also I found myself being corrected to say Palo Alto instead of Palo Alto. El Camino Real instead of El Camino Real. Yeah. Very confusing when people correct you not only on your English, but on your Spanish. But it was then when I had that fateful cup of tea. And as I continued growing spiritually, I looked into Joseph Campbell, and our first 20th century philosopher. He wrote a book called A Hero with a Thousand Faces. And I was motivated to read that book because I saw it on PBS. He was giving lectures of that, and I became very curious for the first time about that. Simultaneously, I realized that in 1989, the AIDS plague had really taken over my city. And I was losing a lot of friends in my work and outside who were artists. And I had no spiritual scaffolding to hold me together to bear those sorrows. They were quite intense. And I remember walking to Union Square right outside my work, and I saw in the posters that said, "Come to the Inner Reef Committee to learn about the research and education of AIDS." And it was the only organization that was doing that. So by osmosis, I began to learn a bit here and there of UU mission and vision. But most remarkably was my opportunity to understand more about AIDS and the impact, the social impact. And my contribution to it was simply to go and visit those whose relatives have not come to visit because they fear or they were ashamed. So I created my first chalice basket, and it was a teapot with 2 cups and cinnamon toast, which are my favorite. And I will go and visit these patients, and it was quite moving, my visits with them. And there we did have some very deep and interesting discussions about our soul, the afterlife, and even about politics, which I was very naive at that time. I considered myself a political person. Little did I know that I was going to become a UU, and I better be at the front of politics in so many ways. Then when I had the opportunity to go back to school as an adult, I ended up living in Amherst and Northampton. And at the congregations there, I would have chalice tea parties. And basically those parties were fundraisers, small fundraisers for the caring committee. And that was lovely. Then I transferred here 10 years later to Clearwater. And I looked around and I felt compelled to create opportunities for people to share a cup of tea. And the reason why I thought that was important is because in this congregation, every year there was great loss. Every year people were going more to memorials than to weddings and baptisms. And so I understood, like I did at the beginning when I took the chalice basket, that we needed to have a chalice tea. And so I made it my mission to talk to every minister that came my way to create at the end of the year, either November or December, a chalice tea. And basically it was for us to share what happened in our life during that time, right before they approach the holidays, so we can have an opportunity to take a moment and pause and really have a real conversation about where we are, where our spirits are, and our hopes as we approach the holidays, which perhaps for many will be the first one alone without their loved one because they lost them. In my covenant group, I shared the story. And to my absolute blessing, Ann Myers invited me to her home, and she had this incredible tea for me. And that moved me so deeply, because since then, not only have we become some of them, she has become like my closest friend, but she has given me the opportunity to grow my spirit in ways that I will never imagine. And I have with each of you in some way or another share a cup of tea. Some of them at the chalice tea, some of them in their homes, some of them at my home. But each tea that we share is an invitation for you to take a pause, to reflect, to look at the beauty of the moment, the beauty of sitting down with someone who cares and who wants to listen to you, wants to listen to your joys, your sorrows, to your vulnerabilities. Wants to listen to your vulnerabilities and your strength, your fears, your courage. But more than anything, it's an opportunity for us to have real conversation, share real thoughts and ideas that are going to make us look at each other and be compassionate and be caring and be strong together. And so my journey, my spiritual journey, is particularly within these walls, have been absolutely enormous in the way it has breathed richness in my spiritual life. It is my hope to continue doing the chalice tea, and I will look forward this fall to share that cup of tea with you. If not then, before, anytime. what I want you to understand is that this invitation is not only from me to you. I want you to look around and think of someone that you would like to have a cup of tea with. Someone you don't know. Someone of any age, because we can invite our young ones for a cup of tea. You'll be surprised how much I learned from them. It will give you an opportunity for you to pave your world and to pave your spiritual life in a way that is rich, that is loving, that it is forgiving, but more than anything, it is real. I see you at the next tea.